English teacher, not a preacher, Mrs. Deborah Bukowski.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to represent our faculty, and I want to thank you, the class of 2024. This is truly one of the highlights of my career. It's possible that some of you voted for me out of pity because you heard rumors that I was leaving at the end of this year. In fact, I may have encouraged those rumors by spreading them myself. But I'd like to think that your vote was not out of pity or because I gave you candy all year, but truly for one reason only. I am Skibbity Riz, and I am She asked if I was going to give you a shout out in my speech today. I have decided that I am. At this time, I'd like to recognize by name the students who submitted work likely completed by ChatGPT. So if you hear your name, please stand. Starting, I'm kidding. Some of you know that I like to tell stories. I'm going to tell you one final story, a true story that took place during World War II in a small town in Minnesota. I was not there, just so you know. Not just a little bit younger than that. In May 1944, Mrs. Johnson, a middle school teacher, made a choice to do one kind, encouraging act that had a ripple effect for generations. In those days, 8th grade graduation was significant because, believe it or not, only about 50% of students in the U.S. in the early 40s graduated high school, and in rural communities, that number was much lower. Mrs. Johnson noticed that one of her students, Rosie, had missed her math exam that she needed to pass in order to graduate. So after school one day, Mrs. Johnson, uninvited and unannounced, drove 14 miles to the farm to give Rosie the exam. While Mrs. Johnson recognized intellectual potential in Rosie, there was much she didn't know about this introverted girl's life. Rosie was the 9th of 12 children. 2 of her older brothers were in the U.S. Army fighting in the South Pacific. Her parents were preoccupied with keeping the farm afloat and didn't have the time or energy to focus on the younger children. At 13, Rosie was often left responsible to care for her 3 younger siblings. And that day, when Mrs. Johnson drove up the driveway, Rosie was still in school. "Oh no," whispered Rosie as she saw math teacher exit the car. "What is Mrs. Johnson doing here?" Her parents were working the fields with some older siblings, so Rosie's quick mind was already planning on escape. She sent her youngest brother, Johnny, an equally sharp and adorable preschooler, to tell Mrs. Johnson that she wasn't home. Instead of leaving, Mrs. Johnson told Johnny, "Then I'll just wait until Rosie returns." And Mrs. Johnson turned around and headed back to her car. After a few minutes of panic, Rosie figured if she waited long enough, Mrs. Johnson would leave. Instead, Mrs. Johnson pulled out a cigarette and lighter from her purse and leaned against the car, a blonde vision of beauty. Now, let me interrupt the story to say I actually don't know what Mrs. Johnson looked like. She might have been 55 and hideous, but in my version of the story, she's about 32, beautiful, long hair, and she looks like a Hollywood star that's smoking a cigarette. This is called writer's embellishment. Anyway, as Mrs. Johnson waited and the cigarettes piled up, Rosie realized Mrs. Johnson wasn't going anywhere. Finally, Rosie gave up and went to the door. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Johnson. Johnny didn't tell me you were here. I was just washing the dishes," Rosie lied. "I'm sorry I haven't been in school, but our family was in quarantine because my brother Chester had scarlet fever. You can't come in, our house may still be infected." Mrs. Johnson replied, "You need to pass your exam in order to graduate. Take the test in the house and put it outside when you're finished. I'm sure you'll do well." Reluctantly, Rosie took the exam at the kitchen table while Mrs. Johnson waited outside. Now the story seemingly ends here. I don't know what happened to Mrs. Johnson, although I can guess that no one acknowledged her kindness that she did that day. Rosie did graduate in the 8th grade, but she didn't go on to college or discover the cure to disease. Like most young women at the time, she married not long after high school, had 3 boys, and lived what would be called an ordinary life. But she never forgot Mrs. Johnson's kind act. Mrs. Johnson's one decision that day instilled in Rosie the value of education and the importance of quietly encouraging others, and in turn, Rosie instilled those values into her own 3 sons. A physicist at the University of Kansas, a Marine officer who became an engineer and then a police officer, and a son who worked his way up through management at Best Buy. More importantly, all 3 men are some of the kindest, most helpful gentlemen you will ever meet. But Mrs. Johnson's impact didn't stop with Rosie's 3 boys either. Rosie's younger siblings were also eyewitnesses to this act of encouragement that day, and this story would be passed to their children as well. You see, my father was Johnny, the youngest sibling of Rosie. Because I heard that story of Mrs. Johnson multiple times growing up, she has inspired me to go the extra mile. Sometimes I failed, and for those times I apologize. But in my better times, I remember. I look around this room, and I'm hopeful and even inspired by so many of you already, because you are Mrs. Johnsons, the quiet, strong people who do acts of kindness to encourage others with no thought of reward or recognition. I spoke to my colleagues just this week and heard story after story of seniors who show up and quietly encourage others. Lily Sindick, a young woman who waves at her teacher at the start of class every day. Liberty John, who regularly shows compassion. Leland Heisel, who's one of the hardest working, do the right thing kind of person you could ever meet. Anthony O'Brien, a true gentleman who just yesterday, without asking, carried a chair over to another student class so she wouldn't have to get up. Kiara Silvestri, who always gives everyone the benefit of the doubt, and if necessary, a second, third, and fourth chance. Mitchell Meyer, who despite enduring loss that most people 3 times his age haven't experienced, brings positive energy and respect to every classroom he enters. Caitlin Ball, who diligently works hard and thinks critically. She makes teaching a joy. Liana Salmata, who lights up her room and then always tries to see the best in people to encourage them to be shining lights also. Brianna Wall, who uses her own time, money, and crafting skills to surprise others with beautiful, thoughtful gifts. Mira Williams, who shows love and generosity through the delicious food she makes and shares with everyone. And Walker Source. I don't think you've ever met Walker, but if you would do me the honor of introducing yourself to me after the ceremony, I would be thrilled because my fellow teachers could not stop raving about what an encouragement you have been to them. One teacher actually said, "Oh, I love Walker." To multiple students in my class who on February 14th this year passed out Valentine's and brought candy for every other student in class, for all the students who attend concerts and shows that they're not even in, to students who sit in the stands and cheer on the girls' softball team, or the football team, or the United basketball team, to all the students who crowd in the conference to sign the good luck banner for the girls or boys who are going to state. I salute you. To encourage others is a gift that will live on for decades. There are countless others, and I wish I could acknowledge each of you by name. But let me tell you that I see you, we see you, and we thank you. To all of the graduates, I congratulate you today. I honor your achievement, and I challenge you to be or continue to be like Mrs. Johnson. Be the ripple that starts a wave that impacts generations. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Bukowski, for your thoughtful remarks. A little bit to think about, right? Her wisdom of 30 years. So once again, a round of applause again. 30 years of